Good morning again. I hope you have rested well, and thank you for being here bright and early. I'm sorry we had a long and rigorous day, but as I said, when time is so short and there are only 2 days to cover a large agenda, I fear we have probably overworked you, but I hope you will bear with us today. Today, I think this panel will probably give you a better idea of what innovations in American government work is all about. The Innovations in American Government Awards was introduced about a little over 21 years ago, and since then we've liked to think that innovations in government has become a global movement. And here today what we have are what we fondly refer to as our sister program. We are, this is the, more or less all the programs that we work together. We have been working for a long time together, and we learn from each other, and for that reason we have a group called the International Innovations Liaison Group. We meet from time to time to learn from each other. Now, we have been talking since yesterday about great many innovations. And indeed, innovations have contributed enormously to the improvement in the functioning of the government. There are no two opinions about it. There's still a long way to go. But while it is nice to be able to claim some satisfaction that things are moving in the right direction, I think we need to reflect a little bit more as to where we want to go. And this session, which my colleagues had planned, and Peter Spenk will have more to say about it, has one common theme which brings all of us together. That is our commitment to social justice. And so what I will try to do in the next 2 to 3 minutes is set out what I have in mind. I haven't discussed this with my colleagues, so I may or may not be in tune with them in my view. So I say this, but I am fairly confident we won't be far apart from each other. The discourse on government innovations has largely focused on the reconceptualization of government, to redefine the role of the government in the governance of the society, to make governance more effective, and harness technology to deliver better governance at a lower cost to the society. In the last quarter of a century, since the movement for government innovation began, we have moved away from the concept of government to governance. And we have witnessed some spectacular changes that have done much to make governments more effective. However, the discourse on new governance is somewhat limited and does not adequately address the concerns of developing societies. In the first place, a large part of the impetus for government innovation has come from developed countries with mature democracies, and hence it has taken for granted the existence of strong and established democratic institutions and rule of law. And because the debate has mainly been focused on efficiency, on the reduction of the cost of governance, and more generally to whittle down the all-embracing role of government, not enough attention has been paid to the question of social justice. More importantly, the zeal for the pursuit of efficiency through adoption of marketplace practices appears to have become an end in itself, and thereby obscured the very purpose of good governance and the centrality of the role of the government as the guarantor of social justice. Government is and will remain central to our society. An efficient, effective, democratic government is the best guarantor of social justice and an orderly society. While the case for democratic governance has already been made, there is at the same time no denying that there is a large gap between the ideal and the reality. Most of the democratic governments, even those in the developed world, are not functioning optimally, and their record in promoting social justice has at best been only partially successful. If you look at over the last 2-3 decades of development around the world, you notice that this has been a period in our history with the largest economic expansion, the like of which that has never ever been seen anywhere, any time in our history. Yet, during the same period of great economic expansion, equity has suffered, inequality has become much more widespread, and much of the benefits of the growing affluence has gone to a small proportion of the people. That is a fact, and which almost undermines the very basis as to why we all care for democracy so much. Better governance and smarter public management, and not merely economic growth and market liberalization, is the answer. Economic growth is important, but it is a means to an end and not an end in itself. The end is and must be the quality of life and the well-being and human well-being. Only now, slowly, belatedly, reluctantly, the development community has begun to focus on the importance of the role in the empowerment of the poor. Reinventing government has come to be more than just effective government. It must be democratic government that enjoys popular legitimacy and effectively fulfills the role as the guarantor of social justice. For a large part of the democratic world, democratic government is still an aspiration, and the concept of innovative government to be meaningfully applied to developing and transitional society, the scope of reinventing government has to be extended by putting back social justice at the core of governance concern. As I have said, the existing literature on government innovation takes existence of democratic governments for granted, does not show any explicit concern for social justice. The challenge for us, therefore, are twofold. First, how to make democratic governments, processes, and institutions function more effectively, especially in the developing societies. And second, how to ensure that the governments fulfill their role as the guarantor of such. These are two critical issues about government innovations and will be needed to be addressed. Unless government innovations can do these things, can actually make a qualitative improvement in the lives of the people. While I'm very proud of what we have achieved, my concern will be innovation will not be worthy of its name unless we can contribute to the well-being and the well-being of the people. And that must be the test of government innovations in the years to go forward. So thank you very much.
Hi, good morning to everybody. Excuse my throat. Just so you know.
And now with climate change, communities and households are struggling with their everyday life to survive, searching for jobs, for food, for shelter, for clothing, and to live in a dignified manner through proper sanitation. But most of these communities and households are unaware about their fundamental rights to basic services and commodities. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. And this is an article from the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. But as I said, most of these communities are unaware of those fundamental rights. Nekesa is a young girl who lives in the outskirts of Kampala. Just like any other 10-year-old girl, she is entitled through the universal primary education to her right to education. A research that was conducted in 2002 by Makerere University, one of the largest universities in Uganda, revealed that many disadvantaged primary school girls in Uganda were absenting themselves during their menses. Those who attended classes did so under stigma and tension for fear of soiling themselves. Their absenteeism led to poor academic performance and subsequent dropping out of school by the girls. Furthermore, additional research during the field trials revealed that 90% of the urban poor women and girls did not use off-the-shelf sanitary pads, but improvised with pieces of cloth, paper, among other things. The reason being, imported pads were too expensive, and hence the need for affordable, safe, and sanitary pads. So what is it about innovation, and where does innovation begin? I will try to use this example to focus on innovation, not on struggles. A lot of the research, a lot of the work we've done in Africa has focused on these struggles of everyday life. The Innovations Program focuses on the innovation, the way people try to be creative to address their day-to-day problems in a productive way in order for them to live in a much more better way. But again, there's the whole question of justice. Although there is the universal primary education policy in Uganda, does this really necessarily ensure that every child, boy or girl, has a right to education, to retention, and to good performance? So although the whole area of social justice is defined in a very broad way, I would like to look at it in two very basic ways, in terms of fairness for the boy and the girl child, and in terms of the way it provides equal opportunities for them to benefit from these policies that have been advanced, but most of the times by our governments. So the story of Nekesa becomes very interesting on how we move towards innovation. And who is it that should innovate in order to deal with this glaring problem? Makerere University went on to respond to the findings of this research. And in the development of a simple cottage and locally manufactured machine that's making affordable yet safe sanitary pads to retain primary school girls in school instead of dropping out of school because of their menstrual periods, these pads are now widely available to them. The sanitary pads, which have now been trademarked and are called Maka pads, are ecologically friendly, environmentally sound, biodegradable, use recycled paper, and locally available regenerating papyrus. Additionally, the Uganda National Bureau of Standards has tested and approved these pads. So how did the program managers know that the innovation has been effective? What measures have they used? With prices of the pads on the Ugandan market costing about Ugandan shillings 1,500 and 3,000, which is approximately $1 to $2, the new brand of cheaper locally made pads has enabled girls to buy them at a maximum of 50 cents, US 50 cents of a dollar, an equivalent to Uganda shillings 900 for a packet of 10 sanitary pads. The recognition of the need for girls and young women to access affordable sanitary pads and protection in order for them to attend and also be retained in schools and improve on their performance and also be involved in sports has grown within the East Africa sub-region. This program is now being replicated in Kenya and also in Tanzania, and many NGOs have taken it on. And for instance, in Kenya, we know that there is a low-cost version of it that is providing this facility to over 800,000 poor school-going children who have been missing a combined 2.9 million school days per year due to lack of this basic necessity. The sanitary pads can generate income and therefore are sustaining arm of a non-profit initiative, and have also moved on to lobby governments to make a contribution to their manufacturing of 20%. Research is also being conducted on the availability of papyrus grass, which is the raw material that they're using for producing this kind of pads. Additionally, it's also being used in Sudan, in the refugee camps, and therefore the replication is moving on and making this basic necessity available. I just want to highlight, what does this kind of example teach us in terms of innovation and addressing a social injustice process where there is a policy, but the policy does not go much deeper to address some of those issues that ensure equal rights and fairness to basic commodities. There are three issues that emerge from this example. The whole issue of scaling up through policy, the education policy, which, if you ask for an assessment, says ensures the right of every child or girl to school, but does not have this very fundamental assessment at a very, very basic individual level in terms of its assessment. And again, who should innovate? I think any institution, whether at local, national, research level, can be able to innovate. But I think one of the things that has been coming up is the co-production. In this case, the University of Makerere was the innovator. But they've worked, again, with government, they've worked with other civil society organizations, and the linkages of this co-production is the one that ensures the sustainability and the rolling out of such a program. I think the third element, which was also emphasized yesterday, is the link of the innovation to scientific and empirical research. We realize that with this, we've been able to now identify and see that, that the scientific research contributes. It's not just advocacy per se, talking about rights of education for girls, but it is backed by scientific research that shows the dropout rates, that shows the number of hours that girls are missing out of schools, and that shows that by providing this necessary basic facility and providing a just life for the young girls, that we are able to make, through innovation, to make a social and just society for both the girls and boys within our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're well aware that you'll probably have lots of questions as we move on, because most of these things we're talking about are very direct and have a high degree of impact. So the way we're organizing this session, we're going to take three brief presentations, and then we're going to stop for half an hour of comments and questions, and then we're going to take two more, and then we'll have another half an hour at the end. So don't worry, if you made a few notes, in a little while we'll be opening the floor so everybody can make some comments, okay? Now I'll pass to Rhoda Kadali. Rhoda.
Yesterday's panel on health set the scene for my presentation today. There's no issue more stark than the astronomical inequities generated by South Africa's health policy, or the lack thereof. When it comes to HIV/AIDS and related diseases, South Africa is currently entering what we call the graveyard shift of the pandemic, in that 800 people die a day. Approximately 6 million people out of a population of 45 million are infected. Yet South Africa shows no political will to address the pandemic with a focused national strategic plan of action, as Botswana has done. Currently, about 350,000 people are on antiretroviral medicine, way below even government's target of 500,000 people. A week before I left South Africa, one of our newspapers had this as a headline, that 75,000 children will die before turning 5 in South Africa. And South Africa is supposedly the most developed on the African continent. Recently, 3 mortality audits were conducted by the Department of Health, our Medical Research Council, and the University of Pretoria. And according to their statistics, 260 children and mothers die in South Africa every day due to inadequate health facilities, inadequate health care given by health workers, and a lack of transport to health facilities. Child mortality is 69 per 1,000 kids, 3 times higher than Brazil. And the biggest killers, the 5 killers of mothers and children in South Africa, is HIV and AIDS, malnutrition, newborn illnesses, childhood illnesses, pregnancy, childbirth, complications, all underlined by poverty, of course. HIV/AIDS accounted for 35% of child mortality, and 11% of child deaths are due to diarrhea. And the sad thing is that both these things are treatable and preventable. The Every Death Counts report reports that 1,600 women die each year because of complications during pregnancy and childbirth. A third of children who died were severely malnourished, and more than 6% were underweight for their age, and at least 294,000 children are currently living with HIV and AIDS. And black infants are more than 4 times likely to die than white infants. 16% of African males are infected, compared with 5.6% of white males and 2% of Indian males. And all of this is compounded by the prevalence of TB in South Africa, which of course was a legacy of the migrant labor system, poverty, insanitary conditions in the mine workers' hostels, and conditions on the mines. But that is no longer an excuse. We have been in charge of the New South Africa for the past 13 years, and we have done very little to stem the tide of TB. So with tuberculosis, we have 8 million annual infections. And what we have is people are becoming resistant to cheap, fast-acting, first-line treatments because patients have failed to complete their treatments, as we've heard yesterday. So we have multi-drug resistance to TB has spread all over South Africa. And just a few weeks ago, 53 people escaped from a hospital who had extensively multi-drug resistance, and 52 of them died. 1 survived. And you can imagine what a big problem it is in South Africa, and we have done extremely little to deal with the issue. So more than 5 million people, HIV-positive citizens, are vulnerable to TB in the way we have it. So we have a Department of Health that is unwilling and unable to build adequate diagnostic facilities and specialized units. We have a Department of Health that is struggling to manage HIV and TB infections together. We have a Department of Health where half of the TB patients are co-infected with HIV and not being cared for. And TB makes greater demands on the public health system because the infected must be removed from their families, their communities, and their jobs. Recently, we have a very precarious national health situation, and that's compounded by the fact that we train doctors for Canada, for the UK, for Australia, for New Zealand, for Dubai, but they are not in our country. Almost a quarter of all government posts are vacant in the health sector. The South African Migration Project revealed that almost 50% of health professionals wanted to leave South Africa due to poor working conditions. Now, I am the director of the South African Innovations Award Program, and we have written up all the HIV/AIDS projects that we have awarded over the past 8 years. And here they are written up, and you can have copies of them if you're interested. But before antiretroviral medicine was made available, most of our projects help patients die and live a dignified life because there was no treatment available. So what we have written up in these 2 booklets are stories about home-based care, palliative care, voluntary counseling and testing, etc., etc. And it's only in the last year that treatment was made available. And so we are going to award in May a number of HIV/AIDS projects that are dealing quite excitingly with the pandemic. One is called the Friends of the Mossveld Hospital in KwaZulu-Natal. In a very remote district, a partnership between the corporations, the community and the hospital came together, and with money from the corporations, they have decided to train indigenous rural kids in healthcare. And what they have done is to have open days to visit the schools and entice kids to go into healthcare. And just very briefly, on this program, we have developed 43 doctors already. 105 are enrolled, and the incentive, many incentives are given for them to stay within the rural areas. And the pass rate of these kids in this healthcare program is way above the national norm. And it shows that it can be done. And of course, government is coming on board to support these students and to help, but they didn't have the idea. The idea came from the doctors who worked in the rural areas to retain many of these young students. And then secondly, another project that we are going to award in May, the 17th, at our award ceremony, amongst probably 10 exciting, innovative treatment programs, is a project called the Autonomous Treatment Center. A private primary healthcare clinic was set up in 1994, the Ndlovu Medical Center, but it later evolved into a non-profit organization that sought a comprehensive solution to more efficient healthcare in the north of South Africa, called Limpopo. And they set up an autonomous treatment center, a model of service delivery for integrated HIV/AIDS, STI, TB, and palliative home-based care. Secondly, they also focus on problems that hinder effective healthcare in poor areas. They look at the lack of health education and information. They look at unemployment. They look at disease-related morbidity and mortality, and a proliferation of orphans and vulnerable children and how to deal with them. So the autonomous treatment centers give a range of services like nutritional support, prenatal care, voluntary testing and counseling, etc. But one of the best innovations is a laboratory service that they've introduced to help with the management of HIV and TB at these centers. And so this ensures a rapid and effective treatment and quality of care for patients. So in partnership with a laboratory, each autonomous treatment center has a fully equipped laboratory in a shipping container. And on entering the clinic, the patient's thumbprint is scanned on the print recognition unit, and a unique number is chronologically assigned. All patient information is captured against this number, while all the tubes are pre-printed with barcodes to clearly mark what type of investigation must be done for viral loads, etc., etc. The laboratory software connects to unique patient numbers, and through scanning the bar tube, the blood specimen is connected to the patient number. And via this interface, lab requests from the doctor immediately shows inside the laboratory, and the lab technician is sure what investigation to do. No human error occurs, as manually written numbers are not allowed. Results are automatically sent back to the doctor from the lab so that he or she can access it inside the cubicle on the PC. So when the patient returns to the clinic, the right result is available at the press of a button. And I'm going to end there by telling you, you all know that we have a very vibrant social movement in South Africa called the Treatment Action Campaign. And they have mobilized the community. They've taken government to court on their tardiness. They have mounted enormous campaigns in honor of HIV/AIDS patients. But a book just off the shelves last week, written by one of our award-winning writers in South Africa, he traces the plague. He goes to a rural community, and like an anthropologist, he finds out, why is it that we are not able to change behavior in South Africa? And as you all know, more young women between the ages of 15 and 25 are affected by the disease than young men. And he found out that the one thing South Africa is doing very wrong is to make the disease public. That many poor people do not have access to private medical doctors, so that when they stand in long queues of clinics for days on end, everybody can stigmatize them and point out that person is infected. And the young man whose life he follows is a very successful rural businessman. And he said, even though I saw that antiretrovirals changes people's behavior, I'm not going to go on it, because if I stand in the queue, people will know that I'm infected and they will not come to my shop. Thank you.
Well, on this brief global visit, now we're going to...
My presentation will not be regarded as an official statement, because it's just based on my finding and participation. This year is very important for China, because it's not only Olympic Games, but also it's 30th anniversary of reform and opening up. In terms of improving social justice, I think China has its own experiences and lessons. At the start of reform, as for China authority, one of major methods among reforms is to widen social gaps in order to escape from constraints from planned economy and egalitarianism and revital this society. Mr. Deng Xiaoping has said some regions and groups should be encouraged to become rich ahead of others. So according to his expectation, those regions and groups will help others, and all of them will become equally wealthy finally. Actually, some regions and groups really become very wealthy, and the whole economy to grow very rapidly. The average life condition for all populations have been improved. For example, the extremely poor is reducing from 0.25 billion in 1978 to 28.2 million in 2002, and the poverty incidence rate from 30.7% in 1978 to 3% in 2002. But unfortunately, the income and wealth gap is not reducing, but widening. The Gini coefficient reached to 0.447 in 2001 from 0.288 in 1981. So in the late 1990s, social justice and equality has become a very important issue for the whole society. So in 2002, the new leadership took the power. It began to pay more attention to social justice. Of course, they also emphasize economic growth. First of all, the authority reconstructed its ideology by adopting the development outlook of putting people first. It stressed that the development is of the people, for the people, and by the people. All policies and decisions by the government have to start from and aim at realizing and developing most of people's fundamental interests. Of course, in the past several years, our governments have made some innovation, try to improve social justice. For example, promoting election reforms. In addition to increasing elections on the grassroots level, the authority began to give urban and rural citizens equal voting rights in electing delegates for National Congress, strengthening rule of law. Laws about guaranteeing social justice are given priority while the National Congress make laws. Increasing public participation. The authority requests all governments have to adopt effective ways for public participation. Now in China, you can find hearings, auditing conference, network communication between officials and the citizens. Also, you also can find participatory budgeting in some places. We also making government more transparent. In 2007, the City Council issued regulations on making governmental information public. We also re-established financial transfer system and building social network, reforming income system, establishing the lowest wage standard. So the government also increased negotiation mechanisms. Of course, in China, the central government is very strong, so most of the innovations are made by it. But the local government are also very active in making innovation. So as for my programs, I found in the past 4 rounds of innovation awards, the percentage of innovation relating to social justice is relatively high. So this innovation are relating to protecting immigration workers, women, and children. It seems they are very effective in solving concrete problems. I think if we look back at China's experience, I think 2 lessons are worth emphasizing. The first is rapid economic growth, of course, is very important for solving social justice, but it cannot result in automatically social justice. Secondly, the state should play a key role in guaranteeing social justice, at least in 2 ways. On the one hand, it should try its best to keep its autonomy and avoid manipulation by some interest group. Secondly, it should provide fundamental interest conditions for social justice. So now in China, we see democracy and the rule of law is 2 pillars for institutional framework. Thirdly, social justice, cannot be left to the state or the market. We should rely on virtuous interaction among the state, the market, and the civil society. Of course, now civil society in China is pretty weak and underdeveloped. Fourthly and lastly, local government is very important for social justice because it's the nearest public authority for local residents. Of course, in China, they are very important for the central government to implement its decisions and policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Shui Dong. Okay, we'll take 30 minutes now for questions, but also from comments. I think often when we framed by a question session, people often want to just comment, and so they put their comment as a question. If what you want to do is just comment, then say, when you stand up, this is a comment, and say it quickly, and then we get to the questions as well. So we just divide this. Okay, can we have some hands? We see there's a gentleman here and a lady here. We'll stay on that table too, to start off with.
I'm from Bangladesh. I've got a question for the South African problem.
Could you speak slowly into the mic? Okay. Well, we'll take 2 answers for that. No, we'll take a third, and the gentleman here. Could you wait for the microphone, sir, please? It's just so everybody can hear your comment. Please.
I want to know about South Africa. I understand that the magnitude of HIV/AIDS is very high. Is there any survey which mentions about the main factor, main cause for such a high magnitude of AIDS in South Africa?
Okay, thank you. We'll take those 3 then. Rhoda first, and then Cecilia.
Life is cheap in South Africa. We have 40% unemployment rate. Poverty is the order of the day. And so crime, we have 20,000 murders a year. Life is cheap, so people think nothing of infecting each other because we're all going down the tube together. And that's how men talk about it. And you have to have multiple strategies to deal with the pandemic. And there is no leadership around the question. And the sad thing is that our NGOs, we have an army of fantastic NGOs that are doing what government should be doing. And that's why we're rewarding them in the hope that they will be replicated and adopted by government. But there's no political will from government to even support some of these NGOs. And just to end off your question, what we do is we use our award winners to train their counterparts in other regions in the country where nothing is happening. And last year we had a huge NGO HIV/AIDS workshop, and we invited chief prevarication, lack of support, denial about dealing with the HIV/AIDS problem. So luckily now we've got a new ANC leader who will deal with the problem. I'm convinced of it. And that's the only hope we have.
Okay, thank you. I think with that also you get the feel of that working with innovations is not just a question of giving awards. Working with innovations is really about action research. And it's action research right out there at the leading edge, because obviously when you have major and highly complex issues like the one that we've just been talking about here, there's no point in sitting back and trying to devise the ideal government strategy. Sit back and say we have to have policy. I mean, what you need to be able to do is to get right out there to the leading edge and say, like Rhoda and her colleagues have been doing, look, this is working. Start to learn from it. So that gives a sort of different way of thinking about the production of knowledge, which I think is very characteristic of the whole sort of innovation style of thinking that's coming down. Okay, we now go to girls at school. Cecilia.
Yeah, I'll just also briefly comment on the HIV/AIDS issue as a model where the prevalence rates of HIV/AIDS have actually gone down, and one starts to question, what are some of the issues that have led to this rates going down, whereas in other African countries like South Africa, like Kenya, the prevalence rates are still very high. And I think one of the issues, like Rhoda has mentioned, is issues to do with leadership at the highest possible level. And within our programs, we have been working with mayors through a program called Amical, trying to get the mayors and the leaders at the very highest level starting to talk about it, starting to go for public testing, and starting to destigmatize, make it not a stigma anymore. And also at the local level, innovations, particularly where the home-based care services, which a lot of times do not access the PEPFAR funds that you're talking about, because these PEPFAR funds a lot of times have been riddled with bureaucracy, of course corruption, going to the wrong pockets. But at the local level, women are working with local communities through home-based cares, and we've started to see an impact at that very local level where people are talking and discussing amongst themselves and dealing with the problems and addressing it at the household level. In terms of the curriculum, to go back to the schools girls issue, they have been, and when we go back to our database, I can be able to pick out quite a number of innovations that have come up. The review of the textbooks that are used for teaching purposes, a lot of them were not very gender sensitive. There have been programs, mainly NGOs working with the curriculum, developing institutions, trying to make the textbooks and school books that are used much more gender sensitive and responsive to the needs of the girls. There has also been attempts in some of our countries to introduce sex education at a very early age. This, of course, has been met by a lot of resistance, particularly from the church, the Catholic Church. But this has been happening, and it has been integrated in most of the school curriculum. There's also some innovations related to affirmative action, where they recognize that girls are disadvantaged, whether it's purposes of school curriculum or due to retention or due to the capacity to attend school in a systematic way. Affirmative action has been introduced, which again has been debatable, etc., but these have been attempts. And one of our winning programs of our last year Mashariki Awards was a program that in one of the slum areas that have introduced informal schools. These are schools where children don't have to go with school uniform, they don't have to be a certain age to be at a certain grade, and therefore these schools are attracting even girls that are much more of an older age, and they fit into the way the school program has been developed, and which also responds to their day-to-day needs in order for them to be retained in school. So those kinds of innovations are also happening. The one on the marker pads was just one example to look at the injustices in terms of girls' rights to education.
Okay. Can I see what we else? We have somebody also down, but I'll take 3 points here, please, first, and then...
I want to compliment the first two speakers for their courage and honesty in describing what can be done to improve their countries. And we were shocked and dismayed to hear the last presentation on social justice on China, and it was completely silent on a number of issues, including freedom of speech, where individuals have been jailed recently for posting information critical of their government, so they're now in jail. Freedom of assembly, we've all read about the news, about protests in Tibet and about Tibet. The fact that television producers are not allowed to film from Tiananmen Square, for freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion, since the jailing and death sentences of Falun Gong members. The Vatican secretly appoints cardinals because the church is controlled by the state. And then, of course, there's all the issues of social justice in terms of prisoner relations, organ harvesting, and the like. And I'm wondering if the panelists, either the organizer or others, would like to speak about why the discussion on China was completely silent on those three fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take another two. There were two other people on that table, I think. Can you put your hands up so we can just... Oh, the lady there, yes. And the gentleman and the lady.
I also had a question directed primarily to the panelists from China, but I would be interested in hearing other people's perspectives as well. And this is trying to understand how governments innovate. One model is that civil society innovates and government then adopts or scales up that innovation. But it seems that the way you described that civil society is quite weak in China. So I'm guessing that that's probably not so much the model there. So I'd be interested in hearing, number one, does the government in China adopt innovations from civil society, or is it internal innovation? If it's the second case, when you have a very strong central government, how are local government agencies able to innovate? Or are you able to identify why some local government are better able to innovate, whereas others are not able to innovate? I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Thank you. Ma'am?
I'm Poonam Mutreja from India. I'm going to spare the Chinese more questions, except one, which is you said that inequalities have been reduced greatly. While I understand from the data that not maternal mortality, but longevity is decreasing, HIV/AIDS is on the decrease, there's a huge problem with migrants. So perhaps you'd like to enlighten us on what are the positive things we don't know about. But I wanted to quickly comment, if I may, on the scaling up. As Dr. Gohar, as we said, the innovations have to be in government for decreasing inequalities. Now, the way the NGOs deal with inequalities is very comprehensive and flexible. And I think, and I say this to the colleague from South Africa, we cannot scale up innovations because we can't scale up the flexibility, the commitment, the integrated approach. So I believe we really need to look at the who, what, and how of scaling up. We can't expect our pilots to be scaled in totality in government sector. So we have to really look at, as NGOs, what elements can be scaled up.
Okay, thank you. Shui Dong. Well, you knew it was coming anyway, so it's just a question of when.
Yeah. I think the first question is, it's tough for me. It seems but this kind of three freedom are very important. I agree with you, but so it depends on what kind of view you adopted. So if you just use a historical perspective, maybe you can find actually this kind of freedom have been improved a lot. So of course there's still many issues, but as for me, because I'm a researcher, I don't know how we can for China government solve them very quickly. So maybe we should take time. As for second issue, of course China is very centralized, but we should pay attention to each huge country. So it's very diverse. So there's many local governments. They also have their own characteristics. So they still have a space to innovate. Of course, if just look at the institution level, you can find actually the institutionalization is not complete. So the local governments still have enough space to innovate. Thank you.
Okay, there are a number of examples from China in our little books, and also on the website of the programs. So I do encourage people to learn more about. And I think one of the characteristics of Chinese local government innovation is that when it takes place and when it makes sense, that often it spreads and gets scaled up very, very quickly indeed. So I think that's a very interesting. There are downsides to centralization, but there are upsides to centralization when it has to do with getting good ideas moving across quite quickly. Sorry, Rhoda.
I think on the HIV/AIDS front, Botswana and Uganda disprove your point that when you scale up an HIV/AIDS a national strategic plan, you can deal with the problem. And I'll give you an example. In South Africa, the Western Cape government was not a ruling party government. It was run by the opposition party, and they instituted the best mother-to-child prevention program, which became provincial-wide. It included all the rural clinics, all the local clinics, the schools, para-state organizations, and we had a really grand-scale program in the Western Cape to deal with the problem. So what we need is a government to harness and work together with the proliferation of NGOs we have in the country. The Autonomous Treatment Center that I described to you, if that project becomes a national program, we won't have the problems that we have.
Okay, Minister Massafa had made a request a long time back that he'd like to present the North African point of view. So hang on to your questions. You'll have 2 minutes to do that. And then we'll take 2 more speakers, and then we have another 30 minutes for more points and more questions. So this is really a workshop rather than a panel. Minister, would you like to...
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. I listened carefully to the South African experience. And I want to talk about the experience of North Africa. I speak in Arabic and Mr. Abdel Latif translate. قضية العدالة الاجتماعية الحقيقة ليست قضية.
Can we have another microphone, please?
No. We have. أن قضية العدالة الاجتماعية ليست مسألة إمكانيات مادية للدولة، وبالتالي هناك فرص كثيرة للتجديد في هذا المجال.
Social justice is not a question of material resources. We think that there is several opportunities and several ways for innovation in this area.
وتونس سبقت استأنست بعدة تجارب، خاصة بتجربة الجرامن بانك في بنغلاديش والقروض الصغرى، ولكنها استحدثت أنماط جديدة للتنمية الاجتماعية.
Tunisia was very careful regarding to experience like in Bangladesh, but she also tried to be innovative and to put in place some new mechanism.
في مجال التجديد هناك آليتان، آليات قانونية، والآليات القانونية تتمثل أولا في إدراج مبدأ التضامن في الدستور منذ سنة 2002.
One major innovation is to put the solidarity as a value in the constitution.
والمبدأ الثاني هو إرساء الاستشارات الوطنية وأخذ رأي المواطن في كل السياسات التي تهم مستقبله.
The second major innovation concerns the consultation of citizens Each time we have a major problem, we try to put the question on the citizens and to listen to their specific needs.
في مجال محاربة الفقر أريد أن أشير إلى 3 آليات هامة.
In facing the poverty issue, we put in place 3 major innovations.
إحداث صندوق وطني للتضامن الاجتماعي 26
We have a national fund for solidarity.
وهو صندوق يقوم على مبدأ تطوع المواطن في تمويل هذا الصندوق.
This fund is funded by voluntary contribution from citizens.
كل يوم 8 ديسمبر من كل سنة المواطنون يقبلون على التبرع.
Each 8 December of each year, we have a national day for solidarity, and people bring their modest contribution to the national effort of solidarity.
مكن هذا الصندوق من إخراج 1,200,000 شخص من الفقر.
1,200,000 people were extracted from poverty thanks to this fund.
التجديد الثاني هو أحداث صندوق التشغيل 21.
We also put in place a fund for unemployment.
مكن أكثر من 700,000 شاب من الحصول على شغل لأول مرة.
700,000 people who had the opportunity to learn something new and to complete their university curriculum to have a chance in the market framework.
أما الآليتين الأخيرتين فهو تمكين ضعاف الحال من الدخول إلى القطاع العام.
We also decided to give a priority for those who come from modest family when it comes to offer to them an opportunity to have a job in the public service.
وأخيرا التنصيص في التشريع على تخصيص 1% من الوظيفة العمومية للمعاقين.
We also decided to have 1% of the jobs for the disabled people.
شكرا.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think one of the things we learn about in working with innovations is that people who are involved in trying to solve problems like to listen to each other to hear what people are doing and like to talk. And so we have it's a very community, you might call it, world. And that's the way we learn from each other. And so we'll carry on learning from each other, because now we're going to go firstly to Peru, and then secondly we're going to the other bit of the United States, the ones that most people don't know very much about or think that it's all sort of died out with the Bangy Bangs and John Wayne. So, Gonzalo.
For the development of social sciences in Peru, with inspiration and financial support given by the Ford Foundation. This program has been sought to identify cooperation experiences among state agencies and civil society, experiences which have been proven to be innovative, fruitful, and which may be repeated. The contest has sought to showcase the most successful experiences in order to shed light on good citizenship and government practices. Indeed, it was a matter of encouraging cooperation on a local level among actors who, in principle, concur on their purpose of improving the living conditions of the deprived. It was about fostering the idea, as was written by Peter Spink, that good government means citizenship, social inclusion, and rights. In a middle-income country like Peru, there are 2 implicit assumptions in this effort. Firstly, that economic growth is prone to concentrate income, reproducing exclusion and perpetuating poverty and the absence of opportunities for the majorities. Secondly, the party system also turns out to be hardly representative, which is why the needs of those who are left out are not addressed. So self-organization efforts and the establishment of links with the state agencies and national and international NGOs is a very important possibility of social betterment. In any event, the contest is committed to achieve a new profile in the relations between the state and society by gathering the experiences which imply efficient and innovative cooperation. In the case of Peru, the relations between the state and society can be thought of with the help of a diagram constructed by two axes. As you can see in the PowerPoint, along the horizontal one, governances can be distributed according to the level of presence of the majority in the decision-making process. We have then, from an extreme of exclusion, where the majority doesn't have any access to political representation and power, a typical characteristic of oligarchic regimes, to other extreme, where citizenship is generalized and there is a party system which is sensitive to the interests and expectations of the voters. Along the vertical axis, governances can be distributed according to the level of institutionalization that may be present. In this case, we also have two extremes. The lower extreme corresponds to a precarious set of laws and regulations and to the predominance of the leader or strongman. Therefore, institutionalization is weak and the performance of the government unpredictable. Meanwhile, the upper extreme is characterized by a binding set of laws and regulations which allow organizations to function more regularly. Now, what is typical in Peruvian society is the exclusion of more or less 50% of the population. In general, there is a weak citizen consciousness and the party system leaves out a large part of the population. In these conditions, conflict and direct action are likely to predominate. Subaltern sectors oscillate between withdrawal from the public sphere and violent protest, vandalism, blocking roads, etc. They do not feel there is another way they could be listened to. In these conditions, it emerged what Chatterjee, an Indian historian, calls political society, a type of governance in which government officials act as peacemakers of conflicts generated by those groups that mobilize each on their own on the basis of very concrete demands in a very violent way. Another type of governance which reproduces exclusion, but in a more institutionalized way, is clientelism. This form of governance entails some kind of integration of those who are excluded on the basis of benefits and favors in return for their support through votes or through preserving a fragile state of social peace. In this context, the best thing would be the redistribution of power through the extension and strengthening of citizenship, thanks not only to the development of a party system, but also of the grassroots organizations. This redistribution of power would be beneficial in terms of a clearer and more productive management of state and local organization. Social inclusion and the improvement of living conditions of the majorities would then be possible. This is the situation to which our contest aims to. Nevertheless, although there are encouraging signs that point in this direction, there are huge difficulties involved in consolidating such a movement. We are referring to a lack of credibility and deep distrust in parties and governments, national, regional, and local, which is felt by most of the population. Furthermore, these difficulties have to do with the authoritarian and excluding attitude of government officials, as well as with the lack of institutionality. As a whole, we could say that in Peru, the types of governance have oscillated between a clientelist model where a strong man distributes benefits and favors and an oligarchy that excludes the masses. Nonetheless, it should be pointed out that there have been also governments that have fostered participation of the majorities in a context where institutionality is weak and there is an absence of a system of political representation. As a matter of fact, we have a combination of this type of governances. Civil society works for the middle class, clientelism for the urban poor, and political society for the rural poor and the ethnic groups. That the only way to be listened to is just to violent protests. The recent Peruvian economic experience is one of sustained growth thanks to the neoliberal model and the ensuing rise of sports. However, there is a deficit of political legitimacy due to the social exclusion and the concentration of economic income. In this context, the most problematic factor is the weakness of the party system, which provides appropriate conditions for the appearance of outsiders of what is called caudillos in the Latin American tradition. I want to end this section with the identification of attention. Institutions and a binding normative are necessary to good government, but they can be a barrier to leadership and innovation. On the other hand, however, a strong leadership can lead to concentration of power and corruption. Therefore, the problem would be how to get a balance between leadership and institutions, a balance that allows the initiative of the leader, but within a frame of norms that implies accountability. I am going to finish now by referring to our contest. This contest in Peru was carried out during 3 consecutive years, from 2003 to 2005. As a total, 512 experiences corresponding to 16 Peruvian regions were submitted. 36 experiences were received awards. The subject of the winning experiences were mainly education, health, urban cleaning up, and infrastructure. A smaller number of experiences was related to ecology and the environment, human rights, and tourism. The most important achievement of the experiences was the access of the private groups to resources and services thanks to the cooperation between the state, grassroots organizations, and NGOs. In the development of this contest, we have learned several meaningful lessons that I'm going to point out very briefly. Firstly, to work in a long-term perspective. 3 years is really a term too short to settle the contest in the public sphere. So a longer continuity is needed to have an impact on public opinion. Otherwise, the contest has limited effects. Secondly, it's important to publicize the contest in the media. In this sense, it is fundamental to obtain strategic allies. The contest is important as long as it resounds. It was in this way that the last contest we managed to obtain the support of an important national newspaper and the most important magazine in Peru. A bigger impact was then achieved. This is not an easy thing to accomplish, as the media focuses primarily on news about protests and violence rather than on good local practices that seem as something boring, something that is not very interesting. Thirdly, to incorporate representative institutions and personalities of both civil society and the state. But, well, again, to achieve this commitment is not simple. It is necessary to have tradition and credibility that is built over the years. Fourthly, to award less, but to award better. We must have a clearer vision regarding what type of experience we are going to award. There have been interesting and effective experiences which have received awards, but which, on the other hand, did not so much than efficiently meet the objectives of state agencies. We are referring, for instance, to the campaign to eradicate the larvae of the insects that cause the dengue disease. This campaign was a result of an agreement between local representatives of the health ministry and the organization of the population affected. It was a deserving experience due to its effectiveness, but it's questionable to consider it as innovative. Well, that are the main lessons I wanted to share with you, and, well, we will try the contest to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Didn't get a feel from Gonzalo's presentation.
And I just want to give you a quick explanation of who I am and where I'm from. I'm from 2 different Indian nations that are located in the state of Wisconsin, the Brotherton Indians and also Menominee. And I'm also Korean, so I come from this really eclectic background and have had the absolute distinct pleasure of living in both of my parents' homelands. Not a lot of native children who grow up in mixed backgrounds are able to share that ability to sort of understand and experience their homelands in a real on-the-ground kind of a way. And so this this is a really exciting opportunity for me to share with you all, in this international context, a little bit about the American Indian tribes here in the United States. Really quick about Honoring Nations. The awards program was started about a decade ago, and it's located in a research project at the Kennedy School of Government, similar to the Innovations in American Government program. And this research project has been studying economic development and sort of poverty levels and poverty issues in Indian country for just over 20 years, maybe 22 years. And the core finding behind their research has been the essential piece that government has played in solving real social issues that are addressed or linked towards poverty. And part of that then came to the inclusion of Honoring Nations into this fantastic family of best practices in local governance. So let me give you a little bit of a context about Indian country. That's what we call the political status of the tribal nations here in the United States. If you go by census data collected in the United States, there's about 4.3 million people who self-identify themselves as being native. However, if you go to the tribal governments themselves who keep a census of their citizenship, about 3.1 million people are citizens of tribal nations. So there's an interesting sort of question around citizenship and sort of self-identity and ways in which particularly folks who live off reservation either receive services or interact with the government services provided in urban contexts. About 538,000 Native people continue to live on reservation lands. These are lands that are set aside by the federal government and designated as tribal lands. And of the 3.1 million tribal citizens, about 1.4 million are under the age of 18. So we're dealing with a significantly young population. There are, to add to the sort of complexity of things, there are about 250 native languages that are continued today in the United States. However, only about 380,000 people speak these languages with fluency. So our languages are dying out, and this is a huge concern around sort of cultural protection, cultural relevance, and the way our political systems rely on the language. In total, there are 561 different Native nations within the United States. That includes the 48 states that are located, the contingent 48 states, and the state of Alaska. Hawaii is a separate entity because the indigenous governments in Hawaii were never federally recognized by the federal government. So it provides another interesting conversation around indigenous governments within the United States. But that sort of gives you the basic background of things. It's important for me to tell you all that our sovereignty, our tribal sovereignty, is established by treaties and laws, and we are actually mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And so rather than just being identified as a racial group within the United States, we're a political entity. So often discussions around best practices or innovations in governance include federal, state, and local. And when they say local, they only mean city. And often that's forgotten is tribal. And tribal adds an interesting dynamic because it could exist within multiple state jurisdictions. So for simplicity's sake, it's easier to view reservation lands and reservation governments as sort of state entities. They have their own judicial systems, they have police systems, they have their own healthcare, education systems. There's difficulties around taxes and sort of how the governments pay for these functions. A lot of these functions are paid for by the federal government through treaties, through treaty agreements. But so that's sort of the basic context there. Indian country is the poorest of the poor in the United States. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the poverty levels. I think that a lot of people know that the indigenous populations around the world suffer from poverty. That's not an exception here in the United States. However, the poverty levels are not similar across the board. There are some Native nations who have had successful ventures around tribal enterprises, and they've been able to sort of lift themselves up and provide essential services. Zhui Deng was mentioning a sort of economic development as a means to addressing social justice issues, and that's what we've seen a lot of Native nations doing. That's the beauty behind the last 10 years, is there's an incredible federal policy that was instituted in the 70s by a not so popular U.S. President, Nixon, that it was called the Federal Indian Self-Determination Act. And this is probably the only successful federal policy that has allowed Native nations to sort of succeed. And part of this is pushing decision-making down to the local levels. So now you've started to see over the last 30, almost 40 years, this growth and boom in sort of ways in which the tribal governments are addressing the essential services and essential needs of their citizens, and providing excellent examples, not only for state governments to sort of be able to replicate and partner with, but then also for international governments to be able to learn and grow from and to sort of share knowledge, not just with indigenous communities. The former Eastern Bloc, particularly Poland, has spent a lot of time sort of talking to our research team about how tribal nations were able to sort of create governing institutions that make sense after having years of another governing system placed upon them. How do you create sort of this buy-in from the citizenry, where they see the local government and they say, yes, this is culturally acceptable to us, that we understand the political systems, we understand how decisions are being made, and they're being made, the decisions are being made in sort of a cultural context. And when I say culture of American Indian nations, please don't think that I mean the cultures of the Western movies that you may have seen, or sort of, the 1980s or 1800s. That Indian country has continued to grow and change and adapt modern things and modern technologies, but still hold true to some really essential core values of who we are as individual nations. And the 561 nations are completely different from one another. What applies to one tribal government may not apply to another tribal government. So, for instance, policies that work in France may not work in Switzerland, even though they're relatively close to one another and share some commonalities. Those are things to take into consideration when looking at the systems that Native nations have presented and put forth to the world to sort of evaluate. Really quickly, I'd like to share with you sort of 3 different areas in which I've seen growth and some strength and where we've shared a lot of things in the international context. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of these. However, these books contain our case studies, and there is a liaison portal that has all the Innovations Group's award winners. So if you need more specific details, please pick up one of these books or one of these pamphlets, and there's more stuff in them. So around the political, the 3 areas I'm going to do are political, economic, and social. Under the political systems, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in the state of Montana have done a really strategic layout of how they wanted to form their government. And they spent a lot of time and energy sort of building in the necessary steps and the necessary infrastructure with an uneducated population. The population doesn't have a lot of college graduates. They don't have a lot of folks who have gone off to Ivy League schools. But yet they've been able to sort of partner with local governments around them and partner with outside NGOs to sort of build that internal capacity. And so over the last 30 years, institutions that were normally run by the federal government and sort of run out of Washington, D.C. are now being made at the local level. This is extremely important for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes because these are 2 tribes that were combined to be one tribe, but they were traditionally warring tribes who never agreed on anything. And so for them to be able to sort of create the institutions necessary to sort of function together and meet the needs of their citizens as a whole, rather than having Washington, D.C. sort of force policy down onto them. That was a complete innovation. And you see tribal nations learning from that. And as we're starting to see more splits with countries who haven't been able to sort of resolve those disagreements in the international context, Indian country perhaps provides an opportunity to learn lessons for splits not to happen. There's also the San Carlos Apache in Arizona. They have an Elders Advisory Council, which sort of acts as the ethics committee for the tribal government. They're the ones that actually, they're the continuing voice when you've got political change happening within governments. How do you sort of create this stable mechanism to make sure that the needs of and the voice of the citizens are never forgotten in an entirety? We've seen with the citizen Potawatomi sort of an influx. This is a tribe who, they do have gaming operations, but they've been able to diversify their economy to include tribal holdings that include grocery stores, food distribution, and things beyond sort of the controversial things that you'll hear that coming out of tribal nations today, beyond gaming, beyond cigarettes, beyond gas. And what they're doing is they're building the private sector. They're providing their citizens with necessary loans to support entrepreneurs within their community. And they're not only doing it within the state of Oklahoma and the citizen Potawatomi nation there, they're doing it with all the Native nations in the state of Oklahoma and citizen Potawatomi citizens anywhere within the United States. So they're trying to bolster this self-independence of the individual citizens rather than having citizens rely on either per capita or welfare. Around social care, or around social development, a big issue around Native nations is foster care and sort of the removal of Indian children out of Indian homes and being placed in non-Native homes. And the Fond du Lac Band in Wisconsin, or in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, has done an excellent job of partnering with the local county officials in northern Minnesota to sort of create this this avenue for urban families, urban Native families, to reach out and become licensed foster care homes for these Native children. And before, when the state of Minnesota was sort of had their hands tied and bound by federal legislation around the Indian Child Welfare Act, this was an instance where you saw the tribe taking the lead in this, but standing very closely side by side and helping to strengthen the local state government to better serve the needs of the most vulnerable citizens within the area. And lastly, around social development, there's an intertribal collaboration called the Task Force on Violence Against Women. Just last year, there was the Violence Against Women Act that was reauthorized within Congress. And while this act is not perfect and still has some necessary tweaking and growth to be done, an important aspect that was included in that was around the specific needs of Native women. 50%, 1 out of every 2 Native women will be assaulted sexually. And usually it's by a non-Native man. And this includes complications, further complications, because of jurisdictional boundaries. And so Native nations are not able to sort of protect the citizens' rights, women's rights, and sort of provide safe homes for them. And through this intertribal collaboration, they were able to push the national agenda, work with non-Native NGOs, and sort of get that need and that voice out there on the national scene. So that's a little bit about Indian country and a little bit about the innovations that we've seen over the past 10 years. And I hope that some of them are things and issues that not only happen within the United States, but in the international context with all of you. And look forward to any questions.
Okay, Amy, thank you very much indeed.
Especially with reference to what you have said a number of times about the leadership and political will. And I think this is also equally important for all the panelists, the presentation that we heard. Whether it is an issue of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, or the adolescent rights in East Africa, or corruption in Bangladesh, or human rights in China, or in Abu Ghraib, or Guantanamo Bay, I think
at the end of the day, political will is very important, I think, and that's why I wanted to compliment. But my question to you is, what does it take to generate that political will? In a country, especially in a country like South Africa, which produced Mandela and Desmond Tutu and now Mr. Mbeki, why that political will is not generated? And maybe this is also a point that was raised at the opening intervention by Dr. Gohar Rizvi, that, what we need to do to have innovations for generation of that political will. Is there any prescriptions? But don't say that it depends on the people, because we have seen that people have created the political will, generated the political will, but again and again we have seen how that has failed at the level of politics.
Thank you. And then finally, the third gentleman who's there.
I'm Amitabh from the National Center for Advocacy Studies, India. First, let me thank all the panelists for very fascinating presentations. And I don't have a question, I have a couple of comments.
Great.
I thought that this session was on innovations in government. However, except the last presentation, what I heard was innovations in civil society. So I'm a little worried, and I wanted to flag that I hope that when we're talking of innovations in the innovations, it's not become an euphemism for abdication of state responsibility. So I'm extremely worried that this entire discourse of innovations probably does not really address the central questions and the primary responsibility of the state, which is to ensure social justice. So how do we bring that question into this entire discourse of innovations? I'm glad Gohar did talk of it, that we are not looking at economic efficiency as the objective. That's only a means to an end. But unfortunately, say, just to take an example of the Dubai experiment, almost a schizophrenic presentation on economic growth and development, where even the questions coming from the floor on human rights were probably not addressed for lack of sorry. So they were not directly addressed. And the last point is that I think when we're talking of social justice, we do need to really put on the table that exclusion is a systematic process. Exclusion happens through institutions, political, economic, social, which are created for exclusion. And there is a power dynamics involved. So how do you create an inclusive politics is a question in which power has to be a central concern. And what I heard, we are not really touching the core of inclusion. We are really talking on the fringes of the question of how do you change the power equation.
Thank you very much. Should we take an answer on those?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. We have some more over there.
To address the
Now
question.
it's the ladies.
To address the questions around tribal nations in the United States, it is federal policy to allow the tribes to grow by their own means. This is the Indian Self-Determination Act that I was telling you about, the federal policy. And part of that does include full rights to lands on the reservation. That includes surface rights for timber and subsurface rights for minerals, natural gas, and oil and such. I can speak to that as a whole within the lower 48 states. Because Alaska was purchased from Russia in the 1950s, the land issues there are much more complex, and tribes have surface rights, and subsurface rights are owned by the Alaska Native corporations, which were set up instead of having reservation lands. But this is much more complex and stuff that you probably would never get into in the context of India. However, within the 48 states, there are very distinct sort of boundary laws. Things around natural gas get more complex because if the state of Wyoming is abutted against a neighboring tribe and the tribe has decided not to extract natural gas, that can't stop the state of Wyoming from extracting natural gas because gas moves. So, you know, they can suck the gas out all that they would like. And it would just be up to the native nation to say either go into partnership with the state of Wyoming or to start extracting the gas themselves. There are numerous examples of tribes who have invested in sustainable forestry to maintain the forest, but then be able to harvest the timber and produce lumber and sell that to either paper mills or building, construction, manufacturing industries. Around education and sort of the universal education in 30 years, I don't know how best to answer this question other than to say that because of this Indian Self-Determination Act, the accountability that the tribal governments have to their citizens around the areas of education have strengthened tenfold. And now that the citizens are empowered and the tribal governments are empowered as such to be able to think of innovative solutions, to apply themselves and their creativity to building the necessary educational infrastructure. And over the last 30 years, you've seen a drastic improvement in high school graduation rates. College graduation rates are not at, and so our graduation rates for Native people in the United States has risen to sort of the average. Dropout rates do remain a problem, but it's college attainment that's the next step. So we're starting to see some really significant improvements in the area of education, and those have come along with the Indian Self-Determination Act.
I'll address the question of political will. I think it's a very good question and very pertinent, especially to South Africa. And liberation movements are often bad for democracy because they demand that their citizens be grateful to them for life. And so when a liberation, and that's why we have Zimbabwe, when liberation movements become governments, they have to be held accountable in different ways. But what happens when a liberation movement takes over the country? That people are tired of protesting. Civil society organizations become co-opted and the leaders are often creamed off and go into government and they become like government. If you're white in South Africa and you criticize, you are a racist. If you are black and you criticize, you become a traitor. And so therefore, opposition is good for democracy. Social movements are good for democracy. And within the African National Congress, the ruling party, internal democracy was dead for a long time until Jacob Zuma came along. And with the last election in South Africa, the ruling party election, the current president really thought that he was going to be voted into for a next term of office. And his own intelligence didn't even tell him that people within the party were tired of him. And so when he was voted out of office, the day before, he thought he was still going to win. And so how do you generate political will? It is important that civil society works closely with government and do not give up their role as holding government accountable. And I think we have learned that at great cost. Secondly, it's important to insist that Parliament, that the National Assembly, not become hijacked by the majority party, which has happened in South Africa to the extent that our parliament is dead at the moment. It's important not to demonize opposition. Loyal opposition is a foreign concept in Africa, and it is important for international communities to help grow opposition. And I've seen how foreign donors, foreign governments, they will not support our opposition parties in South Africa because they are beholden to this God-ruled Mandela ANC. The ANC of Mandela is dead, and it is time for us to grow a new government in South Africa. Thank you.
Okay, Rhoda, thank you. I'll take Madam and Madam. We have two ladies, the Madam there and also here, please. Okay, I'm trying to keep a balance here.
Thank you very much. based on yesterday's presentation on rare and rare diseases, as well as this morning's excellent presentations, particularly from South Africa. And I would like to say that there are pockets of countries, small pockets of country in Asia, in Africa, South America, which are not yet infected with HIV, and but they are next door to huge, big, explosive HIV neighbors. Now, the tendency is in such low as in Bangladesh, is a low HIV country. The tendency of the government is to sit back and relax. Now, money is a problem because our main problem is we don't have money enough for the screening that is needed. It is extremely costly as well as it takes a long time. There are children, infants who are born with HIV positive, and they are unable to get their poor mother's milk, the only food that's free, because they will be affected. And even that kind of, thinking is not there, how to provide children with alternative breastfeeding. Now, I would like to say that the social justice is not possible if we do not address HIV, which is a rapid killer, whereas, millions of dollars are being spent on rare diseases. But this HIV is for Bangladesh, it's a new disease. It's a low disease, but it is, you will be surprised that it may have reached a very high proportion. Now, my concern is that the screening is not available, and I request Ash Institute to take it up, that screening is available at a low cost to anyone. There is no stigma in Bangladesh. Women are very forward-looking. They will go to any place if they are told that, select a marriage partner who is not HIV affected. They're likely to do so. It's a very modern, moderate Muslim society. And lastly, that without democracy, of course, we cannot achieve all this, but strengthening the democratic institutions is also equally important. And we need to address these social issues as much as the political issues, which often clouds over these very basic, fundamental questions of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam? I think we're going to be able to take about one or two more, so can I have the hand up? Okay, right.
My question is to Gohar. I think the objective of innovations and governance really has to be social justice. And one of the things that's essential to any kind of innovation is leadership. And I think ethical leadership is very important. Amy, you spoke about the example of a tribe in Minnesota where you had a governing council almost that looked after the ethical issue. I was part of a program which we conceptualized and put together, which is called Spirituality, and it essentially looks at corporate culture and spirituality is what it's called. It looks at the relevance of improving on the best business practices by including a spiritual practice at an organization level in a company, but on a voluntary basis. And it's a program that has been very successful. The last two conferences were held at the European Parliament. And I was wondering about your views, because if social justice is to be achieved, in my view, if we did everything that we do as government or even as private citizens with the idea of human values up front first, love, compassion, then I think we really do achieve social justice. And I was wondering about your views on innovations and government, about including spirituality somehow and human values and government at an institutional level.
Okay, we've got the last one there, gentlemen. If we can be very brief with these last comments, please, and then gentleman over there.
I have a comment on Professor Shudong Yang's presentation on China. He argued that China was a very centralized country. I have, yes, that is true on paper, but in practice, the situation is very different. I have followed China over the past 22 decades and have published this on local governance, 6 books in Chinese languages. language. And my observations are that China, if you look at 2 decades ago, China had more than 40% of its population below poverty line. Today, less than 2% is below poverty line. How this miracle came about? Because the autonomy of local governance. Local government in China accounts for 2/3 of all consolidated public expenditure. Central government is lean. It only accounts for 1/4 of consolidated public expenditures. And local governments were able to innovate and engage in local economic development, and how this miracle about, and local government in China enjoy greater degree of autonomy than many developing countries I know of. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we've got a gentleman there, the last one. Can we run a mic there? Thank you.
I'm Professor Mukherjee from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. I understand that the developing countries acting in unison under the World Trade Organization made a major gain in allowing for the use of drugs that are very, very expensive, and which the big pharmaceutical companies strongly opposed. But in spite of that, they made a major gain, allowing these drugs to be produced generically by developing countries who had the competence to do so, India being one of them. Now, I would ask the question whether this has been effective in bringing down the costs of HIV drugs in South Africa and other affected countries.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start to round up here. Gal, would you like to take a word?
I'll try, but since I was only supposed to be setting the context, not addressing the issue. Kavita, you have raised a very, very important issue, and our commitment to that was reflected in the first panel yesterday. One of the reasons why we had put in a panel on ethics and public policy was simply to emphasize the importance of instilling ethical values in the governments. Whether or not one can institutionalize spirituality is a more difficult question, and I'm not sure how one addresses. But, you know, while instilling ethical values is absolutely important, and that is why at our school there are courses on ethics in public policy, at least one becomes aware of these issues. Whether it will change one's behavior or outlook in later life, one can't guarantee. At least one is familiarized with it. But I think there are also some larger institutional issues that needs to be addressed. The truth of the matter is democracy is not working in large parts of the world, including the developed and more mature democracies. Electoral processes are so skewed that the governments that come out of those electoral processes often do not represent the electoral view. The whole business of campaign financing, I'm not simply talking about election rigging, which of course is also there, but it simply doesn't ultimately, and when the governments do come out, the gap between the government and the governed is so wide, because there is beyond the elections, between the elections, the electorate is completely marginalized. They have very little mechanisms, institutions, processes through which they can make their voices felt. Now, unless you have these, you cannot have enforced transparency, accountability, and so, which lies at the root of ethical public policy. The last point to make is that elections are absolutely necessary conditions for democracy. Without elections, you cannot. But they are not sufficient condition. It requires much more. A democracy requires comes with values. Those values are now missing. Not only the values of missing, like transparency, openness, plurality, freedom of expression, participation, and all those things. But what is also the problem is that democratic institutions and processes evolved in societies which were homogeneous society. Now we have plural society. Almost all countries around the world are plural and in many cases divided. Now, in that sort of a situation, we really need to go back and revisit the institutions and processes so that everybody has a voice in that. Amitabh raised the very important question of how do we include the excluded? The current democratic processes just does not allow. It's the rule of the majority. How do you get the minority to have an important say is not. So there are a lot of larger issues that will need to be addressed, in which, of course, spirituality and ethics must remain part. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I just want to put some things together now to close up on, and also take advantage of answering our colleague's question about government. First of all, we only have a sort of small size table here, and we only had 2 hours, so we couldn't get everybody on the table. So we decided amongst ourselves to give a view of what the innovations programs are working on as a set. But also here in the room are our colleagues, and I'll ask them just to put their hands up so that you can know them and talk to them. We have our colleagues from the Galing Puk Awards in the Philippines. Eddie and Pam, could you put your hands up? There we are, they're over there. Our colleagues from Chile, who are here, Gonzalo and Javier, and Enrique Cabrero's here from Mexico, from the Mexican program. So we represent 10 programs that have got together, and we're growing because we're starting to find other people who are working in similar ways, and we're linking together. For example, now within Latin America, some of us are coming for a meeting where we managed to put together some 9 or 10 different observatories that are working, trying to understand what's taking place at subnational government. I think all of us are working on the same thing, that obviously you can learn from what's going wrong, but you can also learn from what's going right. And I think learning from what may be working is a very good way of doing two things at the same time. And one of them is very important, is giving some recognition to the people who are trying to make a difference out there. And that's very, very key. Often when we give awards, people will say, well, no, you're not giving it to me. No, we're giving this for everybody. And they will make copies of the certificate they got and hand it to everybody, so everybody feels, hey, that's us, we did that, we made that happen. So I think that's one point here. We've also been very helped along the way, not just in terms of financial support, because that's one thing, by the Ford Foundation, but mainly from the Ford Foundation. There's been this constant questioning all of us have been making about what's happening in the world, what's happening in government, what's happening in civil society. And I think there was an old model that was out there, and that was the model that said government has to govern, government has to provide services, the service manager does his service and evaluates it, and then when elections come round, people say whether they like that or not. Now, that was the sort of model. So you'd say 99% of public activity was government-driven by the direct department itself. What we found, it's not a theory, what we found is that in a large majority of cases, at the practical level, you have government and civil society working together to provide services. So, because people need the community groups. We had the example yesterday from Minneapolis. I mean, if you don't have the community groups in the neighborhoods working, planning with the government, you're not going to go anywhere. I mean, that's joint work. It's beyond participation. It's not just participation. It's deciding together what you're going to do, what you're going to prioritize, etc. And so what's happened, in a sense, is that the split that used to be sort of government here and civil society here has started to do this. Not in a sort of smooth way. It's a spiky way, which is good. It has to be spiky. It can't be comfortable. But the word that Enrique Cabrera used in Latin America, which is very helpful, is that the idea of public action. People are trying to work. We've broadened the idea of public. We've not privatized it, we've actually deepened it and strengthened it and made bigger. This seems to be happening. And this is why we call the programs now the Liaison Group for governance, because a lot of things are happening in the way we go about deciding things. I love the idea of a tribal council for people with white hair. I mean, that's really great. It gives me something to think about. I'm trying to propose that to people. And you just don't get wiped out when you get on. You say, oh, no, I'm a white hair, now I can go on the White Hair Council. No? But this whole idea of thinking around your governance mechanisms is vital. And the other great thing is this sphere of public action. Now, that sort of swings around a bit. Sometimes there's more presence of the civil society, and government picks up from that. And otherwise, it's the other way around. You've got more action from government, and civil society connects to that. So I think this is very interesting to think how we work our way through on these questions. And in the different programs, in different contexts, those balances are working differently. And that's real. It just has to be that. So that is one thing. I think the second point to round up on is this whole thing about making visible what is invisible. Now, if you go to the Oscars awards, you have no idea about the rich production of films, the variety of documentaries, the way people are trying to use the film as a media to make stories. You don't hear anything about that. The Oscars make invisible what was already invisible. The only thing you learn about are the 3 or 4 films that everybody likes. What we're concerned about is to make visible that which is invisible, to bring it out, bring it forward, and get it talking. Last week, we had a meeting with, in the Latin American context, in Mexico, at the Mexican equivalent of the Kennedy School, where we brought together mayors, observers, local leaders, activists, to talk about a whole variety of questions like participation, community development, economic development. And it's absolutely amazing. And people say, well, I didn't know that. And how did you do that? Oh, we did this, this, this. Oh, well, I could add that one onto this. I could add that one onto. So this whole, what we've used the word at time, we have to create and give support to this invisible college of people who are talking to each other about ways of trying to solve. So I think that's fine. That's vital. And the third one I'd like to just to end up on is very interesting. Now, when you look at business propaganda, they always go on about how innovative they are, don't they? I mean, that's why you should buy things, because it's innovative. And you try and get on a plane nowadays, and you walk down a corridor where you'll be reminding why this or that or the other firm is incredibly innovative. And usually they say, basically, we're innovative because we're pioneering, or because you have to buy this because it's got so much technology on board that it really is incredibly innovative. And this is the sort of language. Well, we ask people, why is it innovative? And what they say basically is, well, we're solving the problems that affect people's everyday lives. And I think that contrast is something worth holding in mind. So we'd like to thank you very, very much for making this a workshop, which we wanted to do, and everybody bringing their ideas in and talking here, and we'll just carry on talking. Thank you now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.